July 30, Ukraine Media Center continues its operation. My name is Svyrydova, and let me remind you that now we work in cooperation with Suspilne in a comfortable community space called Urban Space 500, and now we will have the presentation of the report called Some Challenges Related to the Reintegration of Deoccupied Territories and Memorialization. Joining us in our studio today are Maksym Yelihulashvili, member of the board of the Institute for Peace and Reconciliation, expert on transitional justice, and Daria Svyrydova, member of the Azores. So, good afternoon, Mr. Maksym. Probably let me try to ask you to present the results of your report. So what are the trends that you observe and what are the conclusions that you draw? So please, I'm asking the technical team to put the presentation on the screen. Thank you very much. So talking about the aspects related to this research, it's important to understand that the data that we present, they comprise two instruments, the national survey and the in-depth survey that took place on the 12th of July in all regions of Ukraine. And we were able to survey about 2,000 respondents who were comparing their experience in reestablishment of governance on the deoccupied territories and the demand on the side of the society. I mean, the trend that we are observing in the context of the discussions in media and social networks and in the society is that we're getting back to the year 21 regarding the expectations from the future. We will also draw some sociological details that you will be able to see, but generally by the way that we draw our expectations, we rely upon the figures that existed before the full-scale invasion. That's a very important aspect that is providing us with the background, and now during a lot of discussions I'm calling this longing for solidarity, and basically, you know, it's the property of people to long for the past. You know, this upheaval that we had, it was important for the survival of Ukraine. It's an anomaly, basically. It's not a standard, because the existential threat made everybody to use the horizontal ties and to respond. And now we have to get used to life in different conditions, in conditions of more atomization that increases the vulnerability of the society, because the existential threat has not disappeared. We've just got used to it, and all those aspects that exist in terms of reintegration, building our policies to make sure that people who stay in occupation for more than 3 years, more than 10 years, those who stay in the area of active combat operations or under constant shellings, we have to continue building this message that would appeal to different territories, to different areas. So if we check out this upheaval in the year 21, now we return to those dimensions, to those indicators that continue existing. What is positive? That we observe more positive attitude if we talk about the indexes among the audience of the lower age and among those 60+ years, no matter how surprising it is. The fact that one of the aspects of reintegration will be issues of quite jeopardizing nature that we're trying to keep track of, not in terms of today's evaluation, but also comparing with the measurements made last year, and we observe certain dynamics here, and the dynamic is quite stable. There is this gap, but it's not a gap, but a difference in prioritization. When people evaluate their own losses, we receive the biggest indicator. This is something related with physical health, their mental health, or the loss of income and the loss of something physical, like loss of the family members, their traumatizing and other aspects. It turns out to be somewhere in the middle of the graph that you're seeing. But when we're asking what is the biggest harm to Ukraine, we have the consensus that the biggest loss is the loss of people, disability that people get as a result of the armed aggression, as Russians attack, or as a result of tortures that are widely used by representatives of Russian Federation in temporarily occupied territories. So this gap in future may be this zone of difference when there will be a question arising about compensation, reparations. So this gap may become another vulnerability in terms of these aspects. If we talk about the general challenges to reintegration, here we unite two methods: the results of national survey and in-depth survey. So the problem is the same: the governance chaos and miscoordination of activities. So it seems like I cannot recall it exactly, but there is a children's book about the country of unlearned lessons, and Ukraine working with war since the beginning of the 2014. There is a lion's share of the trends that were focused on Crimea or the east of Ukraine. It was scaled up to another territory, but the lessons of those territories and the dynamics are not being kept track of. It's not copy-paste for sure, but certain dynamics, the challenges, the problems, they arise in the same manner. And it's more of a question to the government and the international support programs whether they still want to use the practice of reinventing the wheel or to look at what we already have. Another question, another challenge which is important in terms of the occupation of territories is the lack of professional management personnel. As it was said during one of the interviews, it's important to understand that right after the liberation, the occupation, that stress that used to exist in people's lives, it continues to influence their conditions. If previously you were talking to or you were working with different categories of population, as one of the interviewers said, now you work with the traumatized children. So those children, they may be 60 plus years old, but in terms of attitude, they require different approach, different interests. And it turns out that we have to adapt our protocols. There are protocols for the occupied territories. For occupied territories, there are some protocols that are intended to send signals to the territories that spent longer time under occupation, not only Crimea and Donbass, but also the Zaporizhia and Kharkiv regions. And talking about the attitudes to the persons affected, it's polarization to the attitude to those who were affected by occupation both in Ukraine and abroad. It's about compensation that does not take into account certain social conditions. If we get back to the graph, the IDPs don't get such a support in terms of implementation of compensatory mechanisms. And another mechanisms that are seen as big challenge, unfortunately, this trend continues, is readiness to restriction of rights. There is a strong support to restriction of rights of people who ended up in temporarily occupied territories. However, there is still demand for adaptation of services, but when you ask them whether those services or those civil rights would be available for the people after liberation, it's a consent for the support, and the same is for the Ukrainian refugees abroad. So this gap needs to be seen. We need to avoid the lynching in those occupied territories where the government does not pass a test for being fit. And there is a serious question about communication and demonstration of other steps to be taken by the state to hold accountable those guilty of perpetrating crimes. I mean, generally enforcing the law in the deoccupied territory. So if we look at the context of support, what's important, and it seems like it gives us hope that when we talk about not only social support, but also serious demand on the side of the population in the occupied territories, we see that the support for the Ukrainian refugees abroad should be also preserved in this context. So I think there is a huge space for maneuver, and it should become an opportunity for the state to get involved and to develop these or those policies and procedures that are intended to support it. Thank you so much, Daria. I would like to ask you, what are the insights that you found for yourself? How useful was the research for you? And what should be the response of the state to those results here? So let me start. As Mr. Maksym has said, for us, it's a long story made of different vectors, of different surveys, talking about this demand for justice. And this research that was taking place recently, it emphasizes the key trend that we observe after the beginning of the full-scale invasion. And we observe it in the researches before the full-scale invasion, is that the foundation of the processes of reintegration, no matter how what they will look like, the foundation of the core of people's expectations is justice. So we need to research the matter of justice itself. It's quite a subjective story, and we have to understand the way people perceive justice. This is why we try to understand what would allow people to feel justice in a way that the state builds all of the processes after the occupation. I mean, what steps should be taken by the state? This is what we were trying to investigate. We were trying to find those steps that would allow us to ensure this justice on part of the state. And recently our colleagues from the civil sector presented another research on the perception of human rights by the population of Ukraine. And I've paid attention to the fact that among the three core values is the value of justice for Ukrainians. So it's a key trend that we observe on a systemic basis. What in this trend would allow to ensure this perception of justice? What's interesting, Ukrainians expect that the government authorities, will ensure the building of the justice system. So our expectations that the veterans come back and they build the justice system or something else, but the expectations of the Ukrainians, they show that among the top three actors, there are representatives of the state authorities, and more than 50% of respondents point at the president. I think it's very much related to the public communication, of the topic of justice by the president, but all those expectations are vested into president, parliament, government, and only on the 5th or 6th place there are international partners or international organizations. Another important idea is that there is trend that we observe. Basically, it's that the level of condemnation of any activities decreases in terms of communication between the population in occupation with the occupational authorities. It's evaluated by the population of Ukraine as acceptable, and the loyal attitude of the state may be perceived as just attitude. For example, acquisition of Russian passport in temporarily occupied territories, or for example, other steps related to cooperation with the occupational authorities are perceived as an important factor that the government should rely upon building their reintegration policies, which does not always reflect in certain acts or draft acts of our parliamentaries and so on. It's worth also mentioning that among the trends there are such that this attitude is not influenced by the presence of the relatives in occupied territories. Obviously, the closer the population is to the area of active battle operations, the more loyal is their attitude, but generally is the overall trend of cooperation with the people or work with the people in occupied territories, and it's yet another indicator of the fact that after the year 22, more of a population of Ukraine faced the war, plus major migration inside the country. The experience that our population is getting face to face, it significantly influences this loyal attitude to the co-patrons who ended up in occupation, who suffer from the cruel policies of the occupier in those territories. On top of that, we observe quite a good trend. We may safely say that there is a high level of trust in the future with the inhabitants, with the denizens who live in temporarily occupied territories, both occupied since 2022 and those occupied since 2014. So basically 90% see the common future as positive. Talking about Crimea, it's 70%. It's lower compared to year 2003. I mean, the vision of the common future, but again, is the influence of time and emotional swings that depend on the situation in the front lines to major extent. The way that the population estimates the prospects of the occupation and common future, and getting back to the demand for justice that we research in a targeted manner for a long time, and the key challenge of this system will be for the president and the justice system, because the demand for justice boils down to the demand for holding the perpetrators accountable. So 46% used to say that this is what they relate the demand for justice to. Now this figure has grown up to 49%, a little bit less is the compensation for the consequences of the war and establishment of the truth about the war. So it's a certain dimension of expectations to make the justice happen. And among the threatening trends for the authorities, in my opinion, is the fact that in the opinion of 70% of the respondents, there will be no justice if those physically guilty will be not held accountable. And now the majority of the convictions are made in absentia, in absence of the defenders. It says that such justice will not be perceived as real justice by the population of Ukraine, because they related to the fact that they will see the perpetrators in the docks. And another trend is that the responsibility for establishment of justice is concentrated not in courts. Only 13% of respondents say so, or law enforcement agencies, only 9% of respondents say so, but on the president, as I've said, 50% refer the justice to the activities of the president. However, according to his constitutional duties, president has nothing to do with the justice system. But I think that it's a result of communication on part of the government and lack of communication on part of the justice system about what's going on during the court proceedings. Again, there is another interesting trend that we observe, that the expectations are lowering to the mechanism related to justice. So if here we're talking about fair justice, we were asking another question about the court system. And here the expectations are lowered with regard to the activities to be performed by the court system to bring the perpetrators accountable. It decreased 5%, now only 50% have such expectations. Another important step that is expected from the court system is purging the authorities and removal of individuals who were collaborating with the occupier. And at the same time, there is the growth for demand for extra court justice mechanisms. So it's about violent abductions or missing persons, compensations. The demand for financial compensation has grown significantly since year 2020. It may correlate significantly with deterioration of economic situation of population, and probably the population sees that there is no quick justice, and probably they just wait for some financial compensations in case there will be no justice. And the trend is growing to honor the events related to the consequences of war, which is important in terms of processes of reconstruction of the country and overcoming the processes of the consequences of war. Also, the trend is growing to ensure the additional justice mechanisms on part of the government. What does it mean? We demonstrated that the authorities can build such instruments as reconciliation commissions that are being constructed actively now. And more than 50% of respondents said that yes, it's important for the government to do so on a permanent basis. More than 30% of the respondents said that it can become as a temporary mechanism for the government to be used. And the latest survey demonstrates that it's important to have such mechanisms not only in occupied territories, but it's important to implement such mechanisms in all territories under Ukrainian control. I think it's an important trend the authorities should pay attention to as they develop their policies. For example, now the strategy for establishment of governance in the occupied territories is being considered by the state. it is undergoing certain bureaucratic procedures. And for the first time in those strategies proposed to the reestablishment of governance in the occupied territories, such mechanisms are proposed as building the policies of memorialization through certain mechanisms, illustration or verification as an instrument of overcoming the consequences of war. And if this government strategy will be supported by the government, it will respond to certain demand of the society to use not only court mechanisms but also the activities of the government beyond those procedures, the development of such processes as verifications that will prevent the compromised persons from taking positions in new governments, or intensification of memorialization policies. I think it's a very important trend that should be paid attention to, because basically the experience of other conflicts in other countries and the experience of transitional justice policies that are stable within the last years, they are they're set forth in UN documents, and the establishment of justice for the people who were affected by war cannot boil down to justice only. The matter of fair justice should not boil down to court systems, specifically talking about Ukraine of today, when the Office of Prosecutors General says about more than 120,000 documented war crimes that are being investigated, when we really need fair conversation about the fact that probably not all of those 120,000 war crimes would be investigated, that we should build some priority of this work. Probably we need to pay attention to other mechanisms, among which there should be also memorialization mechanisms of verification and illustration that may help eliminate excessive criminalization that is established in the policies of the government. And everything we will remember about those court proceedings will boil down to what we remember about them, but rather than to the facts itself. And to summarize this justice block, I would like to highlight another indicator. There is a very intense demand on part of the society for publicity about what's going on in the justice area, in the court sector. The population says that more than 90% of the respondents say that for them it's important to be systemically informed on the progress of court proceedings related to the most grave war crimes. It's an important element of justice taking place. It's important not only for them to take place as processes, but also to have the society informed about those processes. Well, I have a lot of questions. Let me ask the key ones. It's really very important, and the conclusions are quite demonstrative. Talking about justice, so first of all, it's clear that there is a demand for justice, but it's a demand for personal justice, or is it the demand for collective justice? Because there is, such a very serious edge. There's a lot of those tortured to death, held in captivity illegally, those killed, those who lost their property, those who were violently abducted. I mean, everybody wants to get this basically personal justice, but what's gonna happen? A lot of those cases will be united, thousands of cases united in one. God help, they will be brought to ICC and the things are gonna move on. But I mean, is there any expectation that after those rulings people are not getting the satisfaction that they expect? Well, it's a real sensitive question. It requires honest and open conversation with the society. I've touched upon this issue, and to me it seems that the states should change the format of communication about what justice is and what is the justice going to boil down to. So we have to communicate to the society that not every case ends up in International Criminal Court. Very small cases or groups of cases will be brought there, and the biggest burden of investigation of the most crimes will be put on the national court system, and it's a huge challenge how to build the infrastructure of a national court system so that it can ensure this justice. Secondly, yes, probably there will be some priority built in terms of consideration of those cases, and maybe the government should already not focus on not investigating crimes against sovereignty or the collaboration is that is contested by the human rights organizations. They do not ensure the perception of justice. Probably we just need to prevent the people who could be accused of collaborationism, reasonably accused in doing so, in preventing them from taking positions in the government again. I mean, there are other crimes that require a lot of resources on part of the court system, and we don't have open conversation with the society saying, like, yes, not all of those crimes will be investigated, and the government and the state takes an obligation for building other mechanisms, such as memorialization. The state is building the compensation mechanism for compensations to different categories of population affected by war. The state is ready to undertake the responsibility for lustration policy. So all those cases related to collaborationism should not be put as a burden on the court system. We may have them consider and investigate other cases of more sensitive manner. Yes, Mr. Maksym. Well, when we talk about ICC, it's 100% war crimes of high political dimension, high political responsibility, but I think that in the context of collaboration cases, we may look at different dimensions, and to continue this statement that Daria has started to talk about in terms of complex approach. Why is collaborationism so painful? Because first of all, it's a crime in the context that is perceived by the people quite emotional, because it's about their personal security right here and right now, and on top of that, it's a matter of existential choice. It's something that absolutely zeroes down that dimension of social life. You know, it's not so sensitive for big cities, but it's quite influential in smaller communities. And when we talk about it turns out that in the surveys that we make, we see the consensus, the prioritization that Daria was mentioning, that in the demand for criminal responsibility, year to year, the top officials in the occupational authorities should be accused and held accountable. You know, those individuals cannot be reached because they were withdrawn with the Russian troops, but there are sanction mechanisms, there are other mechanisms to persecute them, and Ukrainian courts cannot always have the property confiscated from such persons abroad, for example. But again, it's the organizational component, is the military service. When people were taking up weapons, or the service in the law enforcement agencies, if you ask the citizens, they say, okay, this is the priority for us. Why does the justice system focus on those whom it's more convenient to reach? And we have real cases when people are being sentenced to a couple of years for handing over a couple of kilograms of meat to the occupiers because it's classified as handover of material values. So how can we say about the high level of declaration of lynching? And when we dive deep into details, for me it's a positive signal, because for the people in liberated territories, collaborationism and punishment for crimes perpetrated during occupation is a test for the humanity, because declaration is one aspect, but again, whether it's a relevant tool for you to bring perpetrators accountable, the lynch court, not just simply, but specification, it's your potential neighbor, and only 11% support lynching. The moral condemnation, like 9%, is way lower when we start to specify it. For me, it's a good signal that the population trusts in the mechanisms that are of legal nature. There is a huge credit of trust that should be maintained for sure, because it's exactly the gauge. And another aspect in the context of this component is, like in the context of lynching, we get positive signals as we specify, and in context of responsibility is quite the other way around, because the level of declaration of other forms other than court is quite enough, but the population doesn't know what kind of tools are those. So we try to specify, asking questions: what are non-criminal forms of responsibility that can be imposed? And 60% of Ukrainians choose court as a tool of non-criminal responsibility. However, it's a priori impossible, but there is this expectation and a huge gap. At the same time, as we look at other aspects such as amnesty, illustration, penalties, is at the level of 20%. So it's a question more to adequate qualification of what is existing and what can be used. And when we say who can influence, for me is quite a positive effect that there is a high level of subjectivity in terms of those crimes that harm specific communities, social ties. So as we remove the court, we get like 24, 21 level of support of local governments, the residents of the communities and other affected. So this engagement in those aspects is quite high, and the key demand to the government is to find the tools that will satisfy that demand and will enable the justice to be established in compliance with the standards for those crimes that pose high level of social threat, that inflicted significant damage, and to give the opportunity of self-regulation in the dimension where it is possible. And talking about trust and justice, previous survey about the trust of the population to different law enforcement agencies demonstrated that the trust to president is falling, specifically compared to the year 21. Trust to the government is falling, trust to the authorities is falling in general, but when we talk about justice and those who are supposed to reestablish it, president is number one. What can you relate it to? Like, this is where we started, actually. We end with this conditional anomaly, and we return to the stable format of life. And another aspect is that objectively the society is in a difficult psycho-emotional condition that is easily switched on, easily triggered, because it's sensitive, and in different aspects there is a prompt reaction, and this is why communication becomes quite difficult even with the loved ones, because you don't know what's the another trigger that will trigger that psycho-emotional reaction. And another third aspect is the statement of the frontier of Yevgeny Hrabovitsky that there is a certain social contract in Ukraine where we use legitimacy as a tool of security. When we vest legitimacy in certain institutions, as long as they comply with the social discourse, and the adult conversation is not always perceived by the society as legal and stably. Trust is used in the horizontal plane. Basically, this is how we used to survive in 20th century, because the state used to be a challenge, and the state was intensifying that aspect. It's difficult to return to adult conversation. And another aspect is the trend to development of responsibilities for this or those actions. We were presenting the big study on collaborationism with the colleagues. It was clearly seen during the work in the occupied territories, the demand on side of the people, that the people were saying during their conversations they were switching from emotional waves to calibration to very precise identification of what type of justice would be fit for them. It was very frequently related to the standards of justice, the intentions, the harm, the damage, so all those aspects not only in compliance with criminal code, but still the population may formulate them. So it's about the tools that would allow to pose their overheated expectations and to understand that the documentation and memorialization of what happens allows me to exhale and to wait a couple of years for court proceedings ruling. And the compensation mechanisms, can it ensure my right for compensation right now? Or if so, it should be used right away, because the court will not make it as a tool with this number of challenges. I completely agree with Maksym's statements. It seems like everything is related to public communication, and obviously the president since the beginning of the full-scale invasion remains the key speaker related to the topic of war and justice. And no matter whether we want it or not, the society keeps hearing it from the president, and they build their expectations built on what president is saying. I mean, the president was saying about this, so he's about to do something. I'm not sure whether Maksym was mentioning it or not. The population of the occupied territories relates security to justice, including personal security, security in the region, and building of this security objectively depends a lot on the authorities and law enforcement agencies. So respectively, those expectations of security are very closely linked. They're vested in the authorities, and I think it's a positive moment, the window of opportunities for the state in the context of justice by the results of the heaviest crimes. If the government develops, and it's complicated, if they develop a high-quality infrastructure for the communication works, for the investigation of crimes, of the heaviest war crimes, it may allow to return the trust of the population in the court system, which is not so high, and to government authorities. For them, it's a window of opportunities. This is where the population mandates the government. They say, we trust you. We trust you in ensuring the justice process for us, and then we will be observing whether the government was able to fulfill those expectations or not. And obviously, if not, it will be quite an intense point of disappointment for the population. It can become a point of social tension. I mean, that those expectations for quick justice would not be satisfied. So I agree with Maksym that the government should use that window of opportunities to reestablish the trust, because it's related in the opinion of the population. But we have to develop this communication trend that the government will ensure the justice after the war in different forms with different mechanisms that are used in different countries after the armed conflicts. Thank you very much. Probably the journalists may have some questions to our speakers, so if we have any questions on the floor, please. Victoria Marchenko, Suspilne, I have a question. Can you please tell us what is the period of your survey and in what territories was it happening since the beginning of the occupied territories, Kiev region, and so on and so forth? The in-depth interviews were taking place in February and March of this year, and they were taking place in Kharkiv and Kherson regions where people had an experience of the occupied territories. And we were asking some experts who were working in this area, and the national survey was happening from 5th to 12th of July in the territories under Ukrainian control, including the area of active battle operations. It's a representative review, 2,000 respondents. The rating covered this sociology, those waves of survey. This is why we can compare. We can not only look at the section, but we can also observe the dynamics, which is important in the context not only of controversial issues that we will be facing in terms of reintegration. Another question, Olena Fetisova, Realna Gazeta. Can you please tell us in more detail about the perception of the activities of the residents of the occupied territories by the rest of Ukrainians? What the rest of Ukrainians are ready to forgive to the residents of the occupied territories, and what they are not ready to forgive. So let me put back the last slide of the presentation. So we were not asking this question for not or not forgive. We were looking at the key aspects. What is the trigger in context of other measurements? And this question was related mostly to the documents and the acquisition of passport and other documents. We're getting at a lowering trend because there is understanding that it's the matter of survival, that even when we say that people should come back to Ukraine, they should leave the occupied territories now without the Russian passport. In fact, it's impossible. This is why right here we're getting a large number of people who can tell us about this component, and it becomes a part of national consensus. Another is a matter of staying in the territory. I mean, the humanitarian aid, the acquisition of humanitarian aid, medical services, provision of these or those public services, it's not supported at the level of criminal liability. It was tracked by us on the level of collaborationism. So what should be the responses? We understand in terms of occupation, it should be a number of activities aimed at collaborationism. And the dimension of collaborationism just demonstrates that what the Ukrainians are not ready to forgive is the participation in the government, in the authorities and law enforcement agencies. So those taking part in establishment, the legitimacy through referendums, And those who join the law enforcement agencies, the army, are all in the zone of national consensus. And by larger account, starting from year 2022, it goes through all of the years. And on top of that, collaborationism is so emotional that it's not only us who asks about it. And comparing with other national survey, you can get more or less average picture. So talking about the red lines, this is exactly where it becomes visible and can be dynamically tracked. I mean, preservation of this consensus, there are specifics by the regions, but they don't create some significant gaps. It's like 5 to 6% difference. Thank you very much. Let me add another statement which is important. What we observe where the law enforcement practice doesn't coincide with that consensus. Basically, the formal work in the occupational authorities, it's not a marker of a person to bear criminal liability. This is what Maksym was saying, whether they were part of law enforcement, whether they were fulfilling some law enforcement functions, or they were a part of the occupational governments, or take, for example, talking about entrepreneurs. Unfortunately, there is a practice of persecution of entrepreneurs for exercising their activities in the occupied territories, but among the surveyed trends, I don't remember the figure, it will be in the survey, but there is an insignificant amount of those surveyed who consider it as grounds for bringing the entrepreneurs liable or holding them accountable. So the population doesn't see it as a reason for a person to get convicted. However, devil is always in details, and it's a matter of a nature of such economic activity, because as you go to local communities of the occupied territories, probably Maksym can talk about it in detail, where everything boils down to evaluation of the specific activities of a person. Like generally speaking, was that economic activity aimed at survival of the local community, or was it aimed at support of the occupational authorities? So unfortunately, this demand for detailization and specific evaluation, the consequences of such economic activities, there is such a demand on part of the society, but it is not always in line with the court practice that we observe in collaborationist cases. I would like to add, in the context of economic activities, I was already mentioned, I think in the website you will be able to see, the colleagues from Smyrna presented an extensive survey on collaborationism today, and one of the components of that survey was the continuous meetings with the people from the occupied territories. So during 1 or 2 days, people were discussing about their vision of justice. So those were the people from occupied territories, and demand for any justice. Well, they say, okay, they had income, but that was the only pharmacy where the medicines were available. So we were calibrating it, and then we were coming to quite a restricted number of criteria that, in opinion of the people, were like type of this demand. So except for the support of the troops, it's only the fact that they ended up on the list when the Russian troops or occupational authorities were used for excessive income. For example, I had one dentist cabinet, and then with the support of the occupiers troop, I captured other dentist station cabinets, and I've become a monopolist. Or for example, I was the only one who established a network of block posts who were letting people through. But again, even in terms of taxes, there was a lot of difficult discussions. I was facilitating that discussion. And it was a case, if that business disappears, everything disappears. And the question was, when did people get re-registered? Whether they were registered, the Russians said, you have 90 days, and people went for this re-registration on the very first day, or they were trying to make it until the very end, and they resorted to re-registration of businesses during the very last days, understanding that otherwise there will be confiscation or other instruments of occupational authorities imposed. And for the people, it was an important marker of how to build this justice, because those details, they give you the understanding of prioritization and other activities that provide justice, because now it looks like a complete mess as you see the social surveys. The population have this prioritization built, and this idea is not always picked up by the courts. We have another question. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. I would just like to ask about the Crimea, the last problem. I think that the situation with the business is quite different there, because I mean, it's my personal interest. How after the return of Crimea, I think that the situation with the businesses will be different, because it's a different type of business, recreational business aimed at servicing the Russians only. And there's a lot of Russians who came there to conquer Crimea, and this is exactly what they did. So is there a dedicated survey for Crimea? So let me put it in a different way, whether the attitude to the collaborationists will be different by the regions. Yeah, we observe the general trends. The trends that Maksym described are quite universal. For example, I was giving you the example, if we offer the respondents to evaluate the possibilities of the common future, there is no big difference between the evaluation for the temporarily occupied territories, which are recently occupied and which were occupied a long time ago. And as Maksym mentioned, whether such business was saving of life, or was it continuation of their business, or was it the use or application of loyalty to occupier to get additional profit. I think these criteria may be universal. There was no dedicated survey for Crimea, but now the office of, or representative office of the president in Crimea, and the strategy that I've mentioned as they build or develop the policies for establishment of governance in the occupied territories, they support the idea of universal policies that would be used for all of the deoccupied territories. But it's obvious that there are certain issues in terms of attitude of the persons collaborating with the occupational government. Yes, there is certain difference. It requires another conversation. I'm not sure if we have enough time, but if we talk about the state policies, the state, from the point of view of criminal proceedings, should implement universal position of the state that would be universally applicable to all of the deoccupied territories, or all of the population of Ukraine, or those who will be living those deoccupied territories. So the people should know what is the position of the government to the different economic activities. Now it's a total criminalization of any business, but for example in Crimea, until the year 21, in fact at the level of the law, the businesses were not criminalized in terms of occupation, because there was a dedicated law 1207 that was about the legal regime in temporarily occupied territories, the free economic zone of Crimea. So before the full-scale invasion, the legislation for Crimea, applicable to Crimea, was different, and it's another challenge for the state to take into account the specifics of long occupation in certain territories. Thank you very much for this important and interesting conversation. Let me remind you, we were discussing the challenges for the government in terms of memorialization and occupation. Our team is putting together the schedule for our future activities. Thank you for staying tuned.